Chapter 3. Parents are People Too. Day 1 continued, and with little hope in sight. Soon it was time for lunch and Harry followed the other dirty Gryffindors to the Great Hall. Remus was quick to distance himself from Harry when they entered. Lily frowned but Harry wasn't surprised. Lily and Alice seemed more than eager to sit far away from the marauders. They settled themselves and Harry found himself sitting across from Lily. He liked being able to see her face. His mother was so innocent. She tried to act tough and her language about the marauders wasn't holy. Harry watched her as she ranted, on his behalf, about how terrible they were. The current topic was, "And I always thought Remus was so much better than the rest of them, but he's just as immature and unreliable." Alice seemed used to it and was trying to decide what to have for lunch. Harry could tell that Lily was smart, and she portrayed that persona harshly. But her face was an open book. Her every feeling on display. Harry had learned to harshly suppress this in himself. Dark Lords out for your life, spies and Slytherins, rabid fangirls. He couldn't let everyone know what he thought and felt. There were very few now that brought that mask down, but Lily Evans was innocent. She'd never fought for her life. She hadn't faced her own death, alone. She didn't have some prophecy hanging over her head. Harry's past contained such things and he knew the future would hold these things for her, but right now she seemed utterly untouched by the harshness of this world. He found himself smiling as he watched her continued tirade. Lily looked up and she flushed somewhat, her embarrassment obvious. Alice, who had been seated beside her, was wondering when the somewhat dense red head would notice that Harry was staring at her. "I guess I tend to rant," she admitted apologetically. "Really?" Harry asked. His green eyes crinkled together with some unreadable emotion. Alice bit her lip. She looked between the two, not certain what she was seeing here. A moment ago she might have thought another dark-haired boy had a crush on her somewhat obtuse friend. Now she wasn't certain. "Lo, Alice," said a deep voice. A thud on the bench next to her. The blonde turned with a smile. "Frank," she said, her expression lightening into a smile. "Hi Frank," Lily greeted. "This is Harry Tempest. He's a transfer from—" "You know I didn't ask where you came from," Lily asked. "Spellix," answered Harry. "Nice to meet you," he said to Frank. Frank Longbottom, Harry assumed, was a little taller than Neville. His hair was dark and a little curly. His brown eyes were warm and he smiled a greeting to Harry. "Frank is the prefect a year above us, and he's my boyfriend," Alice said the last bit with a grin. Frank ruffled his hair, a somewhat proud smile on his face. "How was herbology?" he asked Alice. Her face still had a smudge of dirt and the man wiped at it with his napkin. Alice raised an eyebrow at the gesture but fought a grin. "All right. Professor Pod seems to be even more addled this year," she commented. "We spent the whole class looking for a list he misplaced. I still don't see why no one summoned it," Harry offered. Towards the end of class he'd nearly smacked himself for forgetting the handy charm. Alice had stopped him before he'd had a chance to cast it. "Because as soon as we found the list he'd have had us do something else pointless. It was just better to spend the rest of the class looking than have him assign us to manure the fickle fits or trim the hanging dandles." Lily frowned. "Alice, why are you even taking that class? You can't stand half the things we do in it." Alice shrugged. "It was recommended for healing. I just don't have that green thumb he natters on about. I overheard Flitwick say that he was trapped in some sort of giant flower for a few days while in Egypt," offered Frank with a shrug. "I don't think I've ever heard of Spellix," Lily said, taking the discussion away from herbology. "I think I have," Frank averred with a thoughtful look on his face. "It's pretty small. I wouldn't be surprised if you haven't heard of it." Harry's shrug and dismissive tone allowed the topic to drop. Soon the conversation switched to other topics. Hogwarts gossip was a little more varied in this time. Everyone seemed to still be catching up on things that had happened over the summer. Frank was a member of the Pure Blood elite, even if he didn't act the part. Apparently Madame Longbottom was somewhat of a gossip and he seemed well briefed on all the engagements and arrangements that had occurred during the 2 months. The big news had involved the engagement of Narcissa Black to Lucius Malfoy. The Malfoy heir had graduated a few years ago but Narcissa was currently a 7th year, so that is why she went blonde, Alice said, glancing over to the Slytherin table where a slender young woman with a sour expression was eating primly. "Apparently all Malfoys have to be," Frank said with a grimace. "I'm just glad her sister graduated. She was vindictive," Lily said with hesitation on the last word. "The term is bitch." Alice casually disagreed. The chill around the table left Harry little doubt which of Narcissa's sisters Lily was referring to. It was hard to imagine Bellatrix Lestrange as a Hogwarts student. The three others continued chatting. Harry would occasionally look up when a last name sounded familiar. Otherwise, he found himself watching the group around him. Alice was obviously his mother's best friend, if indeed her only real friend. Frank was a new addition, but being a friendly bloke he seemed to get on with Lily well. Harry's expression grew a little stony when he considered the futures of the people before him. Still, tragic as the Longbottoms' future was, it did explain a few things. Harry had always wondered why no friends of his mother had stepped forward to swap stories. Sirius and Remus were more than happy to tell him tales of his father, but they really only spoke of Lily in conjunction with James. He never heard her stories. Harry smiled softly as he watched her laugh and joke with her friends. For the first time ever, she was becoming real. James glared down the table. All right, he pretty much hated Severus Snape since they had met on the train to Hogwarts in his first year. Ever since that day he'd been positive that there was no one he could hate more. The slimy Slytherin seemed to go out of his way to piss him off. They were simply opposites, oil and water. Well, he'd been wrong. In the space of a few hours Harry Tempest was rising to the top of his people I hate list. He actually had a list, something that made Moony roll his eyes. I can't believe he's sharing a dorm with us, James fumed aloud. Remus said nothing. This was the third time James had said something to this effect. The first time he had offered a hesitant defense. Now he didn't even try. I know, mate. Maybe we can convince him to transfer away, eh? Sirius suggested with a feral grin. You really think we can? Peter asked in between bites of sandwich. Remus stared into his food and tried to ignore the eagerness of all three boys. It couldn't be that hard, reflected James. We don't even have to find a way to sneak into his dorm room. Remus was convinced that arguing the point wouldn't solve anything. James and Sirius, with Peter tagging along, would find some way to torment their new dorm mate. Maybe he could switch houses. 'Cause either way you looked at it, Harry Tempest was doomed. Double care of magical creature. Harry said aloud. Lily had given him her schedule, and he was examining it thoughtfully. He couldn't recall ever having a double magical creatures class. It's your Newt year, Lily explained with a reasonable voice. Apparently Professor Kettleburn is going to be handling very dangerous creatures. Harry fought a smile. Maybe his previous experiences would leave him better prepared. Hagrid's idea of tame had included three-headed dogs and dragons. I suppose it makes sense, he agreed with Lily. Also only once a week, he said with a shrug. Perhaps it wouldn't be too bad to spend the afternoon outside. I guess you're headed to Arithmancy, Harry stated. Given the choice he knew where he'd rather be. Yep, Lily said with a grin. She seemed honestly excited about it. No one had mentioned that his mother was mad. Alice and Frank had left earlier. Lily had mentioned something about the future Mr. and Mrs. Longbottom finding a good broom closet. So, Harry and Lily walked out of the Great Hall together. Lily looked up when she spotted a retreating back exiting the front doors. Remus, she called to her fellow prefect. She got no response from the sandy-haired boy. Turning to Harry she tried to grin reassuringly. Maybe he didn't hear me, she said. Sure, Harry replied knowingly. I'm sure I can find my way. See you at dinner tonight. Okay, well have a good lesson and try and avoid those marauders. It's just like them to plan a prank with dangerous magical creatures around. Her voice had taken on a somewhat maternal tone. Harry found himself smiling as he nodded his head. His mother's first piece of advice had been to avoid his father. It was ironic and somewhat funny, but perhaps sound. He knew full well that his father and his friends didn't always play safely. Later this year Sirius's little joke would nearly get Snape killed. Not that it would be that terrible of a loss. Kidding. Just kidding. Really he was only half serious. Bye, he said turning to leave. Bye, Lily called softly. Harry wasn't certain where care of magical creatures was held in this time. Usually they gathered around Hagrid's hut, but that wasn't likely. Still, it shouldn't be too difficult to find a gathering of students. He spotted two black heads and one sandy heading towards the Forbidden Forest. With some hesitation he followed. Professor Kettleburn was a short man with a bristly brown beard. He only had 3 fingers on his left hand, and one ear looked more than a little mangled. All in all, he was more whole than Harry remembered him to be. He could recall an older version of the man limping around minus one arm and a leg. But Kettleburn didn't seem to mind his impending amputations and was smiling cheerily at them all. His brown eyes gleamed with excitement. Great, been waiting for 6th year, going to be fun. I've got some treats for you. Kettleburn marched around, taking attendance and muttering about what a great year they had planned. They had gathered on the west lawn, the forbidden forest far enough away to be comforting, but close enough to make the class wonder what sort of inhabitant was intended for this class. By the size of the large crate behind their professor, it certainly wasn't an easel. The class was large, which was perhaps understandable considering it looked as if all the houses were represented. A few Slytherins, quite a showing of Gryffindors and Ravenclaws, and a couple Hufflepuffs, who looked more excited than any of them. The Marauders, minus Peter, were there. Harry was actually becoming curious about what classes Peter was taking. He hadn't seen the little rat in lessons thus far. Besides the Marauders, there were also 2 Gryffindor girls that Harry hadn't met previously. Both had black hair trimmed short, and were rather athletic looking. Indeed, this class seemed made up of people who didn't scare easily. 2 of the Slytherins were well over 6 feet and very broad. One Ravenclaw looked like he could personally wrestle a blast-ended Scroot and win. It seemed Lily hadn't been lying. Kettleburn's 6th year class was destined to be filled with interest-en creatures. You're the new one, eh? Kettleburn asked, poking a pencil in Harry's direction. Yes, sir, Harry answered. Well, pay close attention and don't meddle in something you don't know. Kettleburn lectured with a clipped speech. James and Sirius laughed at the comment. Remus snickered without feeling. Now class, as I've been telling you for 3 years, this is where things get exciting. I'll be bringing in some dangerous creatures and expect the lot of you to be on your toes and perk them ears. I've got permission from Dumbledore to boot anyone who is wasting my time. This is Newt's people. I won't coddle you anymore. Excited murmurs were scattered through the crowd at Kettleburn's announcement. One of the Hufflepuff boys, his thick blonde hair hanging in front of his eyes, was smiling with a grin that seemed to stretch his face. The Ravenclaws had eyes that seemed alight with challenge. The Marauders were playing the situation coolly. In truth, their ventures into the Forbidden Forest had introduced them to many dangerous beasts already. First off, today we'll be learning about a beast that is lethal and can very easily kill and eat you. Kettleburn jerked his thumb, pointing behind him to a large crate. The crate had, of course, drawn people's interest earlier. However, it had seemed quite harmless before Kettleburn's introduction. As if hearing the man's comment, the crate suddenly began rocking menacingly. Kettleburn didn't seem to mind the movement. He moved backwards, an excited grin on his face. With a tap of his wand, the boards of the crate fell away, revealing a cage and a large creature inside. A few of the students backed away. One of the Ravenclaws looked like he was about to faint. A Cromantula. Kettleburn declared. Gather closer and take a look while I lecture. But not too close, those arms can reach about a foot outside the cage. Harry was among the first to gather around the cage. He took his time to get a good look at this former foe. He'd faced the giant spiders on a couple occasions. His introduction in his 2nd year had definitely left an impression. Their presence in the Triwizard Tournament's maze had also been of note. Still, he'd never seen the creature under the light of day. Looking at it this way, they weren't quite as menacing looking. A cluster of black eyes were surrounded by short brown, bristled hair. This specimen wasn't nearly as large as Aragog had been. Its 8 legs extended only about 5 feet and were also covered with the same bristly brown hair. Now the Acromantula are carnivores. They hunt using a powerful venom that is secreted in the small glands behind their pincers. In the younger ones, such as this, the venom is mostly a paralyzing agent that weakens the prey but does not kill it. Acromantula prefer to eat live victims. However, the older ones have been known to develop a secondary gland which contains a lethal poison which can kill. The class continued to circle around the cage while Kettleburn lectured. Harry found himself wondering if this was one of Aragog and Mossig's children and if Kettleburn had captured it in the forest. Maybe Hagrid had brought him, although Harry doubted that Hagrid had suggested the use of a cage. The giant tended to overlook security features like that. He also wondered if the Acromantula during the Triwizard Tournament had been drained of their venom. Harry distinctly remembered being bitten by the enormous insect. Considering what had happened next, he was very relieved that he hadn't been paralyzed, or dead. These creatures are found most commonly in warm climates, predominantly South America, although a large colony was discovered somewhere in Australia. By colony, let me explain that Acromantula usually live together in large numbers. Another reason why these are classified among the Ministry's list of dangerous creatures. If you spot one, there are bound to be hundreds nearby. Some people who have studied them claim that Acromantula have a strict family hierarchy, where the elder father figure rules over the rest of the colony. There are also conflicting views on their level of intelligence. Some claim that they can actually learn to communicate in spoken languages. Harry found himself rolling his eyes. He'd met Aragog and knew for a fact that they could. Kettleburn was knowledgeable, but he seemed to have gotten most of that knowledge from books. Hagrid's lessons had been based on experience. Perhaps that was why Harry had a hard time paying attention to the professor's speech. Instead, he found himself gazing steadily into the creature's eyes, wondering if it could understand what they were saying. Harry's inattentiveness hadn't been missed. Sirius Black had also been a little bored, and that was never a safe situation. Harry's earlier actions had the young man still boiling with anger. He hadn't enjoyed the boy's disloyalty nor his superior attitude. It brought to mind incidents this summer that hadn't yet been forgotten. And Sirius hadn't grown up enough to distinguish the difference between the two situations, and he was far too stubborn to recognize that he could have been the one in the wrong. His blue eyes shifted toward his friends. Remus, ever the bookworm, was examining the spider and taking rap notes with a quill and a small pad of paper. James was also circling the cage in an interested fashion. He had a faint gleam in his eyes that made Sirius think that the Quidditch star was imaging himself battle against a colony of Acromantula. It was time Harry Tempest learned some manners. Sirius had drifted behind the class and with a forceful nudge, he sent the boy falling forward. The push had shocked Harry out of his memories and sent him careening closer to the cage. It was one of those situations that you could see in slow motion but were unable to prevent. Harry's arms spun out to brace his fall, but his hands never reached the ground. A leg, whose grip felt more like a python, had wrapped itself around Harry's chest and arms. Despite the difficulty of being in a cage, the creature was quickly pulling Harry toward its pincers. Acting swiftly, without waiting for the teacher, Harry called his wand into his hand. He twisted his wrist awkwardly until it pointed towards the more fleshy underbelly. "Stupefy," he said aloud. The red light burst out of his wand and with it the spider clutching him grew still. Harry struggled for a moment to extricate himself before rising to his feet. The class was staring at him with wide eyes. Kettleburn's wand was extended. It hung in the air as he watched the student. "Mr." He obviously couldn't remember his name. Would you like to explain what you just did?" Suddenly Kettleburn wasn't looking worried or panicked but rather a little bit excited. Well, Acromantula have armored skins that repel most magics. Arania Exama will push them back, but if you need something a little more permanent it is best to aim for the more fleshy area in the underbelly. Even still, on bigger spiders you'll probably need more than one person casting. Harry trailed off suddenly, realizing that the entire class was staring at him. He averted his eyes and scratched the back of his neck, ignoring the lot of them. While speaking he glanced behind him to see Sirius still somewhat close. Now he turned his gaze on the boy and sent his best glare. What did his godfather think he was playing at? If Harry hadn't known how to handle the situation he could have been badly hurt. Remus Lupin seemed to catch the silent staring match between Sirius and Harry, and it wasn't long before he pieced the situation together. James was by his side and it seemed that the other marauder had also grasped onto what had occurred. "Very good, Mr." "Well, very good. 5 points to Gryffindor for quick thinking." The class progressed, Kettleburn lecturing more. Some of it nonsense in Harry's opinion. Harry took care to keep a distance from all the marauders. He'd planned on checking his food and sleeping area for jinxes and tricks, but he'd have to be more wary apparently. Still, he wasn't worried. Dodging Voldemort and Death Eater plans since you were 11 made such prank attempts seem harmless. Harry's stunning spell allowed students the chance to get an even closer look, which they took advantage of. Some students even went so far as to touch the spider. Although one of the Hufflepuffs, a girl with brown hair, almost regretted it when Harry's stunner wore off. Needless to say, most people considered it a very exciting class, made even more exciting by Harry Tempest. "What do you think you were doing?" Remus said through clenched teeth. Sirius Black rolled his shoulder and didn't meet his gaze. "Answer me," Remus said. For the first time his voice became somewhat fierce. He grasped his friend's arm and pulled him around so that their eyes met. "Relax, Remus," James appeased. "I'm sure Sirius didn't mean it." He tried to shake Remus loose. However, the werewolf held tight. "He meant it. Tell me I'm wrong." Remus released the boy, flinging his arm away from himself. "He didn't mean." "So what if I did?" Sirius's statement quashed James's denial. Padfoot, it wasn't intentional. Was it? You were just gonna give him a scare, right? James Potter found himself unable to look at his best mate. Truth be told, he'd already guessed exactly what had happened. But he wanted to give his friend the benefit of the doubt. He wasn't gonna get really hurt, explained Sirius negligently. Kettleburn was there. I don't understand what the big deal was. You just don't get anything. You act any way you want and you don't worry about other people. Did you stop to think what would have happened if Tempest had been badly hurt? You could be expelled, don't you get that? Remus charged on ahead as he spoke. He moved his arms around in frustration. Merlin Mooney, what's got your tail in a twist? Sirius complained. Remus buried his face in his palms, pulling them away. After a moment he just shook his head tiredly. Let's just go back to the common room. The werewolf went on ahead of the others, seemingly wanting to be by himself as he walked through the halls of Hogwarts. James hung back and walked beside Sirius. Mooney was acting off. Must be that time of the month. Sirius grinned cheekily and nudged his shoulder with James. I don't know, he might have had a point. Come on, Sirius. There is getting back at the Pratt and getting yourself expelled from school. The leader of the Marauders spoke with a hesitation. James, Sirius whined. You know he had it coming. He had something due, and I don't want to share a room with the blighter, but, look, just back down a bit, Sirius. Black laughed and brushed his hair out of his eyes, sweeping the locks back. I don't back down, he stated firmly. James remained silent, not knowing if there was anything he could say about the situation. Sirius had been more reckless this year than the last. The last summer might have been the reason. He knew that summers at the Black House had gradually gotten worse and worse for his friend. Sirius always seemed to return to Hogwarts with even more desire to distance himself from his family. Tempest did know how to handle the situation though, Sirius said aloud. James turned to see a somewhat pensive expression on the other boy's face. Sirius lifted a hand and slid it through his hair. He even knew a bunch about a Cromantula. Like, he's actually met some before. What do you think that was about? Likely just trying to show off, James scoffed. If he were being truthful, he'd admit to being somewhat impressed about the new Gryffindor's behavior. And, perhaps a little jealous. His inner show-off, as Lily liked to call it, didn't like being upstaged by someone else. James and Sirius soon reached the common room. They crossed the room towards a grouping of armchairs. A few second years were already seated there, but the boys rose to their feet and scurried away at the approach of the sixth years. James flopped into his seat, letting his bag drop with a loud thud. He turned when the portrait door opened, only to have his heart make a similarly loud thud. Lily Evans stood there. Why did his chest always seem to ache whenever he saw her? She scanned the room and the ache seemed to lessen as she spotted them, her emerald eyes meeting his. She looked around again before moving in the direction. It felt like the snitch had settled in his stomach. Hello, she said sourly. Why, Lily Flower, Sirius began. James frowned as his friend smirked and ran a hand through his hair. And what might we do for you on this fine day? Need someone to help you remove that stick you've got shoved up your A. Sirius, James growled, interrupting his friend. What do you want? He asked, turning to the redhead. Lily glared at Sirius. Charming, she said aloud. She didn't bother to look at them, instead directing her vision above their heads. You're in care of magical creatures, aren't you? She asked. Yeah, James said cautiously. She couldn't have found out about the prank Sirius played on Tempest yet. Could she? Harry Tempest. James fought the urge to panic. Was the woman a seer? I'm supposed to show him around, since Remus decided to become like the rest of you and not take his duty seriously. Have you seen him? Remus? James asked. Lily gave him a look that could freeze lava. Harry. James rolled his eyes. The professor kept him back. You're not interested in that Pratt, are you? Sirius asked aloud. Lily colored, her cheeks matching her hair. It wouldn't be any concern of yours if I were, she answered primly. I only ask because he looks just like James, sort of odd since you never seem interested in him. Sirius raised his eyebrows. It's not the way that Potter looks that I have a problem with, she answered dryly. James smiled. It that your roundabout way of saying I'm too handsome for words. Well, don't you worry, Evans. He ran a hand through his hair, making it stick up even more. I'd be glad to go to Hogsmeade with you. But I don't kiss on a first date. I'm just not that kind of a boy. You're impossible, Lily growled. All right, don't be pushy. I guess I could give you one kiss. If you buy the butterbeer. Lily drew a deep breath before narrowing her eyes, the expression one James knew all too well. James Potter, I wouldn't date you if you were the last man alive. She hissed the sentence before turning on her heel and walking back out through the portrait hole. Sirius grinned and shook his head as she left. Merlin, James, that was funny. What a stuck-up prude, still don't believe that you really like her. James frowned as he looked at his friend. You know, not all of us want to date girls who would snog the first pair of lips they bump into. Why ever not? Sirius said wolfishly. Speaking of which, I've got a date with Matilda Wells tonight. Let's just say she does very well indeed. James shook his head. He subconsciously found himself watching the portrait hole. What exactly was Lily's interest in the strange new transfer student? She was taking this prefect business a little too far, wasn't she? And, Sirius's commentary aside, it was somewhat infuriating that Evans might consider Tempest dateable. The prat looked just like him. It was one thing to think that maybe he wasn't her type. He and the other Marauders had even questioned if Evans wasn't, wink, playing beta for the other Quidditch team, wink. After all, there had to be a reason that she wasn't responding to his obvious charm and good looks, particularly if she was responding to that prat Tempest. Suddenly, Sirius's stunt in care of magical creatures didn't seem so drastic. Lily left the common room in a huff. She should have known better than to approach that Potter and Black. Normally she wouldn't have, but she was supposed to help Harry find his way around, and trust those two to leave him behind when he could easily get lost. And Remus was being terrible too. She'd always been able to rely on her fellow prefect to do his duty, as long as his friends weren't around. Lily happily looked up to find the subject of her quest already climbing the stairs. Hello, she greeted. Seems you managed to find your way back all right. Yeah, he answered. He seemed a little tired and hastily withdrew his hand from his chest, as if he had been rubbing it for some reason. Did class go well? She asked. Yeah, he answered. Harry's feet plodded forward without much thought. This had been one long day. Technically he still had dinner left this evening, but the only thing he was looking forward to was getting into his bed and sleeping. What could he say? Time travel was tiring. You okay? His mother's pleasant voice asked. Yeah, he gave her a weak grin. Just a little tired. Are you sure you're all right? You look a little peaky. Lily stopped herself from reaching out to touch his forehead. Where had that gesture come from? Harry's eyes seemed a little sad as he looked at her. I'm fine. Well, dinner should be soon. If you want we can just head down there and wait. The Marauders have taken over the common room and I don't feel like looking at them. Lily scrunched up her nose. Harry looked upward. His bed was so near. But he couldn't say no to this opportunity. How many meals would he get to share with his mother before he'd be cast back to the future and she'd be gone? Sure, he agreed. The pair turned back around and headed for the Great Hall. It was near enough mealtime that a few other students were also gathered. He spotted two Hufflepuffs who had been in his care of magical creatures class. The darker-haired boy gave him a thumbs up and smiled. Right on, Tempest, that was neat. Harry nodded before catching up to Lily at the Gryffindor table. Lily shared him a glance. Friend of yours? Magical creatures, Harry explained. Oh, Potter mentioned you stayed back to talk with Kettleburn. How did the class go? All right, although I've seen it taught better. Lily frowned. In what way? She asked a little haughtily. Harry laughed. Don't get me wrong, it was good and all. It's just Kettleburn teaches like he learned it all from books. And I know he got some of the information of Arcumantula wrong. My previous teacher had more practical experience. Just a different style. Oh, Lily said thoughtfully. I never really thought of that, but one teacher can't personally experience everything about their subject. Yeah, I know. Harry leaned back on the bench, grabbing the edges of the table and looking toward the staff table as he did so. A Cromantula then. Everyone's been buzzing about what Kettleburn might have you tackle this year. Those are giant spiders. Right? Yeah, Harry said. He continued to lean backwards. His eyes were closed now and he was fighting the urge to yawn. Some people were saying he's gonna be talking about werewolves, Lily commented. That's stupid, Harry said. His eyes still closed. Lily huffed. And why is that, Mr. I can teach COMC better than a trained professor. Do you have a crush on Kettleburn? Harry asked. He opened his eyes slightly to see Lily stare icily back at him. You just shouldn't badmouth a teacher. Well, that time I wasn't talking bad about a professor. I was actually saying it was stupid to think that they teach werewolves in magical creatures class. Oh, why's that? Harry rubbed his forehead before looking at Lily steadily. It's demeaning, makes it seem like they are animals or something. I mean, they are just as human as you and me except for one night of a month. It isn't like they can help that. Studying them in a class would be the same things as propping us in a room full of muggles and having them poke and prod us. Lily looked thoughtful. I've never thought of it that way before. You certainly seem to know a lot about werewolves. Harry shrugged. Yeah. Well, a friend of mine is one, so. Lily's eyes opened wide. Really, that's. She seemed to have trailed off unexpectedly, until Harry turned his head and spotted Remus standing only a foot away. He seemed frozen, his eyes somewhat wide and a definite nervous presence about him. Remus, Lily said coolly. The other marauding fools were not in tow, she noticed. In general she could tolerate him under such circumstances, but he'd really been behaving terribly considering it was McGonagall who had asked him to show Harry around. Want to join us? Harry invited. Lily turned to the raven-haired boy. Well, if he could be forgiving, why couldn't she? Remus seemed to sit down stupidly, almost as he didn't even realize he was doing it. He didn't have his bag to fiddle with, and so instead his sweaty palms rubbed against his robes. He was trying his best to appear nonchalant. Harry was telling me about his werewolf friend, Lily explained, her voice a tad warmer. Oh really? Remus couldn't help that his voice seemed a little higher pitched than normal. Yeah, Lily said. She gave the prefect a funny look. So what was he like? I mean, I don't know any werewolves and all I've heard are what people say. And well, I read a little in a defense book. Harry shrugged his shoulders. It's like I said, he's just a normal guy to me. And you know, I've read a few defense books too. Some of them are so inaccurate it would be funny if they weren't so damaging. One claimed that werewolves were volatile individuals, prone to fits of temper and shouldn't be allowed around children. Harry's eyes flashed as he repeated the line that had caused him to burn that particular book, not eliciting even a frown of protest from Hermione. That sounds horrible, Lily agreed. You say werewolves aren't like that? No, my friend is the nicest guy you'd ever meet. If anything, he's too nice, real agreeable bloke. You know, Harry, that is quite interesting, Lily said with a tinge of bookish determination. Maybe you should consider writing your own book someday, or. The girl paused when she noticed Harry cringe. What's the matter? She asked. Me write a book? You've lost your bleeding mind, woman. Lily looked affronted. Well, it was just an idea. And if you don't like what the other books have to say. Look, Lily, Harry said with a steady voice. I'm all for fixing things, but I don't think I'm the right guy. Firstly, I'm not a werewolf, so I can't honestly say I know what I'm talking about. And anyway, even if I did want to, who would listen to me? Remus backed me up on this one. Well. Remus found it difficult to get his throat to utter sounds that sounded remotely like human speech. I don't really know anything about this sort of thing. Lily frowned. It just seems pretty pointless to sit there and argue about how things should be when you aren't going to make any effort to change things. Did anyone ever tell you that you're a shocking resemblance to Joan of Arc? Harry offered with an appraised eyebrow. If that's an attempt at mocking, it was poorly done. Lily lifted her chin and refused to look at him as she spoke. Harry paused. No, actually, I was just trying to warn you of what can happen to Crusaders. Lily glared at him. Maybe you and Potter aren't so different after all, she said with some chill to her voice. Excuse me, I see Alice. Lily soon got to her feet and found her way over beside her blonde friend. Sitting down in such a way that her back was to Harry, she can be kind of passionate about things, commented Remus. His mouth still felt a little dry, but the tone of his voice had steadied some. Yeah, Harry said, a little sadness leaking into his words. He was proud of her too. Harry's own desire to do the right thing must have been influenced by his mother's integrity. But it was also a little disturbing to know that the same spirit would lead to her death. Harry swallowed. This was harder than he thought it would be. Maybe it was because he was tired. His desire to know more about his parents was starting to go at odds with a sense of self-preservation. Surely he'd go mad surrounded by these ghosts, sitting here like some despotic seer. So how was your first day? Remus asked. He'd been watching the way Harry's green eyes seemed to unfocus as the young man sank into thought. What if the new transfer was putting the pieces together? He knew werewolves. What if he figured out? This, of course, was purely panic-driven reasoning. There were no pieces. Remus had only met the boy a few hours ago. Still, he felt compelled to pull Harry into conversation. Did you like the teachers here? A poor attempt to be sure. But nevertheless it served to pull Harry from his thoughts. Yeah. They seem nice. Although, like I was telling Lily, Kettleburn got some of his fact on a Cromantula wrong. Really? Remus asked in honest interest. Harry nodded, scratching his head. He glanced at his watch. The food should be arriving at any minute, then he could eat and go to bed. You seem to know a lot about magical creatures, commented Remus. Just some, Harry said with a shrug. My old professor had a taste for dangerous creatures. Had an Acromantula for a pet. Remus coughed. A pet? Harry shrugged. Can't really blame him. He was part giant, so I suppose it was sort of like having a tarantula, by his reckoning. Yeah. I guess that makes sense. He was a great professor though, and a friend before that. And while he always wanted us to meet the more dangerous creatures, if you listened to him you did learn a lot. Harry nodded. Remus found himself watching the boy discreetly. He seemed tired, his posture a little more slumped than it had been this morning. Remus also couldn't help but feel a little uncomfortable with the fact that Harry continued to be friendly despite all that had happened involving the marauders. Harry's hand negligently rubbed his chest as he continued to stare at the table. With a wash of magic the food appeared. Finally, Harry said, About today, Remus said, speaking quickly. I don't mean to. Well, I'm sure it was just an accident with. Remus found himself unsure of what to say. Look, just forget it, Harry said, speaking more to his plate than Remus. They don't mean to be, well, the way they are, he pressed on. It really doesn't bother me, Harry said. He was shocked to find it was true. He might be a little disappointed in how his father was currently behaving. He might not even quite understand it. But knowing the fate that lay before them, how could Harry want to deny them this carefree existence? Remus found himself puzzled. Harry turned his tired eyes to young Werewolf. There are more important things in this world than whether someone likes me or not, he said. Oh, pass the trifle, would you? Aren't you going to eat actual food? Remus asked, watching as Harry piled his plate with the dessert. Not today, Harry said. He toyed with the food on his plate. Ah, sugar, Harry said with a smile. He knew that his current food choice would have Hermione cringing, but for some reason he'd been craving sweets this year. He'd even become somewhat fond of the lemon drops that Professor Dumbledore tried to force feed people. Harry looked up again. Remus was looking fairly disgusted by the situation. I'll add some stew, Harry offered. He made a small space on his plate and scooped a little of the beefy stew. Remus seemed only slightly appeased. You have odd friends, don't you, Harry? Remus said as he helped himself to his own dinner. Why do you say that? Harry asked. Just a werewolf. A half-giant. Not the type of people most people want to be friends with, Harry shrugged. Yeah, well, I'm a half-blood. There are people out there who probably think I'm some abomination. In fact, I know there are. When you look at it that way. Well, make you realize how useless those titles are, eh? Yeah, I guess. Remus ate a bite of his stew. I don't think Lily is really mad at you, he added. You think so? Harry nodded thoughtfully. Considering she's been looking over here every few minutes to check on you, I'd think not. Remus stifled a laugh. Harry glanced over and met his mother's emerald green eyes. She quickly avoided looking at him. Maybe you're right. Harry yawned. Oi, you better scram, he said, looking at Remus. I spotted your friends heading this way. Remus's head jerked guiltily, watching as James, Peter and Sirius approached. Yeah, see you round. Remus picked up his plate and carried it to where the marauders usually sat. He was quickly gathered back in their little fold. However, James Potter kept shooting Harry glances from where he was sitting. Alone again. The thought wasn't uncomfortable. Maybe he should ask Dumbledore to send him to the Bahamas for a week, anywhere tropical where he could rest and order fruity drinks with little umbrellas. He'd always wanted to drink something with an umbrella in it. He'd promised to go home once he returned to his time. Cross his heart. Harry ate another spoonful of trifle. He wondered how Hermione and Ron were doing. He sort of missed them. The three of them had long gotten past most of the awkward stages of friendship. They'd gone the easy route and simply fought a troll together. Nothing bonds you together better than battling a mountain troll. Harry fantasized for a moment about taking a page out of Quirrell's book and letting one in to see if he and his parents could become better acquainted. No, that was crazy. Probably. Harry finished eating his dinner rather quickly. He still had his school bag, the one McGonagall had provided for his current use, as he'd arrived late and was ill-prepared. His head of house could be uppity when called upon. He slung his book bag over his shoulder and headed for the door. He'd only made it into the entranceway before a clatter of footsteps caught up with him. You could have come and eaten with us, the feminine voice said sourly. Harry turned to Lily with a tilted chin. I thought you were making a point. I wasn't, she stated, flipping her hair over her shoulder. She fell into step beside Harry. There was silence for a long while. Most of the students were still in the hall. Harry found himself feeling rather comfortable with this version of his mother. Lily, he said her name softly. I think it's great that you stand up for what you believe in. I do too. I guess my forte just isn't writing books. Oh, she peered at Harry through similar green eyes. Yeah, well, I guess you were sorted into Gryffindor. The halls of Hogwarts were always somewhat eerie when they were quiet. The old stone corridors echoed even the smallest noise. Harry found himself falling into the comfortable pattern of walking back to common room, easily avoiding trick stairs and working his way through the maze of staircases. How do you know where you're going? Lily asked. I came with you because I was sure you'd get lost. She'd been watching him with some interest as he lazily walked in the correct direction. Harry's step faltered for a moment. I asked Remus. Oh, I can't understand why you're so nice to him. He and the rest of his friends are terrible. You were nice to him, and as soon as those marauders, Harry smiled, she said the name like his was Curse, walked in, he'd just left you. Paying attention to me were you? Harry commented. Lily coughed and straightened. I am merely doing my duty as a school prefect. I'm much indebted, Harry politely agreed. Lily rolled her eyes. Well, at least one prefect has to be responsible. Don't worry about Remus and me, he's in a tough spot, Harry explained. Lily's nose crinkled. I don't see what you mean. Harry shrugged. Maybe it's a guy thing, he said snottily. Lily rolled her eyes. It makes absolutely no sense. So yeah, it must be a guy thing. Harry yawned. Try being a guy figuring out girls. That is like trying to divine the future. Harry smiled wryly at the last comment. The pair reached the common room and Lily provided the password, Mesopotamia. Harry looked around the room that had been his home. Not much would change in the years to come. In fact, they probably hadn't changed much in centuries. Wizards did like to keep a fashion going. Boys' dorms are at the top of the stairs. I imagine the house elves have already provided another bed. And your luggage, I assume. Harry yawned. Thanks again, Lily. You've been great. We have Transfiguration tomorrow, Lily reminded him. McGonagall assigned that reading. She trailed off as Harry nodded negligently. He had no intention of doing any real homework while he was here, but there wasn't any point telling Lily that. Night, he called as he climbed the stairs. Lily watched him in a puzzled way for a moment before going back to find Alice, provided her best friend hadn't already wandered off with Frank Longbottom. Lily was happy enough for Alice, but it did leave her feeling a little adrift when her best friend was otherwise occupied. She thought it almost sad to admit she'd been a little pleased with Harry Tempus's introduction into her life. Showing him around did make things less lonely. Previously in the Great Hall, the Marauders had been having an unusually quiet dinner. Maybe it was because Remus was still a little upset about the commotion in magical creatures. Perhaps it was because Sirius and James were still watching Remus suspiciously, and poor Peter was too confused about the strange tension that had befallen them that he had decided to remain silent and eat the pudding, which was particularly good tonight. But, of course, when Harry Tempus had left the table and Lily Evans had scurried after him, well, such events couldn't go without comment. At least for some people they couldn't. And Sirius Black had yet to learn Ron Weasley's lesson of thinking first and speaking later. Looks like your twin stole your girl, Sirius said, nudging James. Who'd have thought that Evans would be crazy over a guy that looks just like James? Shut it, the Quidditch star growled. Ah, come on, Sirius whined. You have to admit it's pretty funny. You've been trying since third year and he gets further in one day than you have in all this time. James slammed his fists to the table and stood up abruptly. Sirius's mouth hung open. By now James was used to a little good-natured needling about Lily Evans. His fascination with the redhead was perhaps James's most obvious flaw, at least as far as Sirius was concerned. Such a deficit deserved poking from time to time. I'm taking a walk, James declared. He strode away from the table, leaving his friend speechless. I think you hit a sore spot, Remus remarked casually. What's with him? He never minded before, argued Sirius defensively. Remus shrugged. Well, fine. If he wants to be all temperamental over it. Sirius bit into a big chunk of meat from the stew, pointedly ignoring the now empty seat beside him. What were you doing, chatting him up before? Sirius asked through bites of food. Nothing, Remus muttered. Yeah, Remus. He took James and Sirius's wands and he even defended Slytherin's. Peter entered the conversation, listing off Tempus's transgressions as if they were grave crimes. Yeah, well. Don't you think we're a little old to always be pranking the Slytherins?" Remus spoke softly, his voice not carrying above the other conversations nearby. "What do you mean?" Sirius asked. He refused to look at Remus as he spoke. "Nothing. Just. Well, maybe it brings more trouble than it's worth." "And what did they ever do to deserve it? What did they do?" Sirius eyed Remus as if his friend had gone insane. "Is that the sort of stuff that Tempest Guy says?" Sirius's glare took on a darker touch. His eyes seemed to grow colder. It was an expression that always made Remus feel somewhat numb. "Yeah, you're right," the werewolf said hollowly. "Yeah, of course the Slytherins deserve it," Peter echoed. Sirius nodded. "You bet they do, and so does that prat Tempest. He must know that James fancies Lily and is going after her to get back at James." "I don't think," Remus started to argue, but he stopped when he realized that Sirius wasn't listening at all. The werewolf listened as the other two talked, Peter being the dutiful sycophant to Sirius's every speculation. Neither of them even seemed to notice that he had grown silent. Remus pushed the food around on his plate, feeling more than a normal level of unease. It was an uncomfortable feeling. Not since his three friends had discovered his monthly secret had Remus ever felt so isolated. Maybe it was just his over-analytical side, but things seemed to be changing this year. James had already demonstrated a growing weakness in Lily Evans. Something that their leader used to joke about didn't seem so amusing anymore. And Sirius, since the start of the year, had seemed more determined than ever to strike out against the Slytherins. Peter was, as always, just as willing to go around for whatever ride James and Sirius set in motion. That at least hadn't changed. And then there was Remus himself, doubting his friends, striking up an odd sort of friendship with someone they despised. Things were starting to change, and that was a frightening thought. Harry opened his shrunken trunk and examined what exactly he had brought with him. He'd done this at least once a week since the time sand incident, but he couldn't recall what the latest additions had been. At first glance he spotted the hunting knife he'd prepared for the wilds of pre-Hogwarts Scotland. Not be needing that. He tossed it on the bed. There were some thick fur-lined robes. Those were pointless and joined the knife. The short-sleeve shirts and trousers would come in handy. As would the galleons. Harry dug a little deeper, moving around the socks and other essentials he'd packed. Drat, not a single pair of pajamas. Of all the things to forget, Harry's nervous gaze landed upon the second trunk before him. Dumbledore hadn't known about the trunk hidden in Harry's pocket. Somehow during the discussion of time and fate and paradox the subject hadn't come up. Hence, Harry could only assume that the man had provided this second trunk in an effort to make Harry more comfortable. Either that or Albus Dumbledore was a more devious prankster than Harry had previously thought. The trunk in question was lime green in color. A few luminous yellow flowers covered the surface. Harry had, as of yet, avoided discovering what lay inside the monstrosity. But if he didn't want to sleep fully clothed during his time in the past, well, being a Gryffindor, Harry opened the trunk. Inside were a collection of clothing and trinkets that Dumbledore must have assumed were necessities. There were a few robes of curious origin, a book on the fascinating inner lives of dormice, a small bag of the headmaster's favorite Muggle sweet that Harry could appreciate, a vibrant purple toothbrush, some boxer shorts with mermaids who swam about the cloth, as well as, at the very bottom, a pair of pajamas. The nightshirt was a good deal longer than Harry was used to, and its bright orange shade could only be loved by a Chudley fan Harry knew, but the pants weren't half bad. They were the only muted tone represented in the vibrant collection of things that Dumbledore had provided. Harry removed the dark green pajama pants, promptly locking the other things away and hiding the trunk under his bed. The dorm room was as unchanged as the common room, and the familiar four-poster bed looked just as comfortable and inviting. Harry changed quickly, looking forward to sleep. His hands ran along his ribs, absently brushing the bruises that were forming from his encounter with a Cromantula. The spider had a surprisingly firm grim. The door to the dorm room swung open with surprising force, a dark-haired young man entering with steps that seemed to hit the ground harder than was necessary. He stomped to his own bed and flinging the curtains about angrily before he even noticed Harry's presence. "What are you doing here?" James Potter accused roughly. Going to sleep," Harry offered. James seemed to stare at him a moment and Harry was wondering if his father had forgotten that he was going to be joining the dorm. "That from the Acromantula?" James asked, frowning. Harry looked down at his chest. "Yeah," he admitted with a shrug. "What are you doing here?" he decided to ask. What, it's my dorm room, can't I be here? James argued defensively. Yeah, sure, just figured you would still be eating. Harry sat on his bed, still watching his father thoughtfully. This wasn't what he'd anticipated the next meeting to be like. James seemed to mimic Harry's gesture, sitting on his own four-poster. Coincidentally, the extra bed that was now Harry's had been placed beside James. The marauder found himself looking at the other boy in a penetrating way. We do look a lot alike, James stated. There was a tinge of exasperation in his tone. Harry nodded. Yeah, I guess so. Then why? James shook his head and ran a frustrated hand through his already messy hair. Whatever, he tried to say casually. Harry, tired as he was, couldn't seem to turn away from his father. When the boy was alone, Harry thought he saw a little bit more of the man James Potter would grow to become. And he saw a little more of someone Harry had always wanted to meet. I'm sorry if things got out of hand this morning, Harry said. Suddenly he had no desire to keep up a feud with his father. It just seemed to have no point. What was the use of trying to teach James that he was in the wrong? The man would come to that conclusion himself in time. James looked up. Oh yeah. I guess it did. And yeah, no hard feelings. James awkwardly avoided apologizing. You must be pretty good at defense. That shield was pretty good, the boy offered. Harry grinned. It's my favorite class. Yeah? James asked. I like it, okay. You planning on being in a Auror or something? Harry shrugged. Maybe, I'd like to, but I don't know if I'm really ministry material. My dad's in a Auror, at least he was. He's retired now. He always says the ministry's policies sometimes do more harm than good, so I get your point. Tell me about it, Harry said with more feeling than he probably should. James looked at the other boy curiously. Yeah, so James floundered, wondering what else they should talk about. He didn't really like Tempus, but the guy didn't seem all bad. The bruising on his chest stood out vividly, and he hadn't ratted Sirius out. What do your parents do? He cringed at the lameness of the question, but he wanted to keep this going for a bit. Tempus seemed to pale a bit at th question before shrugging. They're dead. James wanted to bash his head into something. I didn't. It's okay, Harry interrupted. They died a long time ago. I was just a baby. Oh. He really wanted to ask how, but it seemed too rude. Harry watched the questioning face and felt a little sickened. They were killed by a dark wizard, he explained without being asked. Night, James. Harry pulled the curtains around his bed so that he wouldn't have to see his father's face. There was silence for a moment. Harry? James's voice intruded for a moment. Hey, can I ask you something? Harry stared at the curtain. Sure, he said hoarsely. About Evans. You and she. I mean, well, I know you just met her, but it seems like. Harry bit off a cynical laugh. Don't worry, James. Trust me, I'm not interested in Lily. She's just being nice to me to be a good prefect. Harry couldn't see James, but he had the vague feeling that the boy had sighed in relief. Thanks, Harry, the relived voice on the other side of the curtains said. Harry listened as the footsteps crossed the room and the door opened and closed. The room was quiet again. Harry rolled onto his side and tried to fall asleep. For some reason he was feeling a little restless. If he were being honest with himself, something he had no intention of doing, he might admit that cryptically telling his father the truth about the future hurt more than not saying anything. Just as warning Lily not to be a hero had left him feeling unsettled. He might also admit that he'd never felt more alone. But he wasn't in the mood for personal contemplations. So instead he tried listing the seekers of all the national Quidditch teams, then the chasers. He fell asleep sometime after Alice and Mika of Poland's Pixies.